At Alverca Air Base, 3 pilots were preparing to ferry a regional jet belonging to Kazakhstan's flag carrier, Air Astana, back home after undergoing intensive maintenance in Portugal. But almost as soon as the Embraer ERJ-190 took off from Lisbon, the pilots found themselves in the midst of a terrifying emergency, unlike anything they had imagined before. Faced with an almost certain catastrophe, the pilots made a chilling request.
Air Astana 1388, requesting vectors to fly over the ocean. We may crash at any moment. We cannot endanger lives on the ground.
November 11th, 2018. Alverca Air Base, Portugal. Here, an Embraer 190 from Air Astana waits to depart for Belarus. Between 2011 and 2020, Air Astana operated 9 regional Embraer E190 aircraft of Brazilian manufacture, capable of carrying up to 97 passengers on short-haul routes, almost always domestic. These short-range aircraft did not usually fly to Europe, except when major maintenance was required. Air Astana does not have its own repair facility capable of performing heavy maintenance on Embraer aircraft, nor does any other company in Kazakhstan. For this reason, such work was and continues to be outsourced to certified maintenance companies in the European Union. To address this need, the airline had a long-term contract with a Portuguese maintenance company. On October 2nd, 2018, the P-4KCJ was ferried to Alverca do Ribatejo Air Base near Lisbon, Portugal, a military aerodrome that also hosts several civil maintenance companies. Under the contract between Air Astana and OGMA, the company hired for these tasks. The aircraft would remain there until October 24th while technicians performed the C-check and ensured the plane complied with the latest service bulletins issued by the manufacturer. Service bulletins are the primary means by which an aircraft manufacturer communicates updates and design changes directly to operators. Some service bulletins are optional, while others may be mandatory, depending on the stance of the relevant regulatory authorities. However, it is considered good practice to comply with all service bulletins, whether mandatory or not, and that was Air Astana's intention. By October 31st, already a week behind the specified date, during final tests before returning the aircraft to Air Astana, the aircraft's message monitor issued a critical warning. Flight control no dispatch. This message indicated a problem with the flight control systems that would prevent the aircraft's dispatch. After several days of trying to resolve this issue, the technicians ran out of leads. They had inspected and tested every inch of the avionics bay and corrected all issues that could have triggered the warning, so they decided to seek help from the manufacturer. In response, Embraer dispatched a technical representative from Amsterdam, who arrived on November 6th to contribute their expertise to the efforts of the Portuguese staff working to solve the problem. Finally, after several days of testing without identifying the issue, it was decided to replace all 4 FCMs, or flight control modules, and the error message disappeared. With the aircraft ready to fly again, a crew of pilots headed to Portugal to bring the plane back. In command of Flight 1388 was Captain Vyacheslav Aushev, 40 years old, with 6,009 flight hours, 4,700 of them on Embraer aircraft. Accompanying him were 2 first officers, Bauersan Karasholakov, 32 years old with 2,692 hours of experience, and Sergei Sokolov, 26 years old with 3,514 accumulated flight hours. On board the return flight to its base, as passengers, were 3 members of the operator's technical staff, including the Director of Asset Technical Management, the Maintenance Supervisor, and the Logistics Manager. In total, 6 people were aboard the Air Astana Embraer. Shortly after noon, Air Astana Flight 1388 was ready for takeoff, beginning the first leg of the journey to Minsk, Belarus. At 1:31 p.m., they began accelerating down the runway. For about 10 seconds after takeoff, everything seemed normal. But then, initially slow and increasingly pronounced, the aircraft began to sway from side to side. As they climbed through the first layer of clouds, the pilots tried to correct the swaying using the ailerons and the rudder, but the oscillations only grew worse. Something was very wrong with the aircraft, but what? There were no warning lights or error messages on the ICAs. Captain Auschev attempted to engage the autopilot, but it did not respond and displayed its first error message. 2 minutes later, the situation had escalated into a full-blown emergency. The aircraft began to bank left, and this time they could not level it. With a violent jolt, the plane rolled into an extreme left bank, causing the wings to lose lift. The nose dropped, and the aircraft began to descend. Within seconds, it plummeted 300 meters before the wings leveled, and Captain Auschev managed to pull out of the dive. At that moment, First Officer Karasholikov issued a desperate Mayday call, informing Lisbon Air Traffic Control that Air Astana Flight 1388 was out of control. Unaware of what was causing the problem, the pilots turned to their training. As they had been taught to do in the event of a flight control failure, they decided to gain as much altitude as possible to create a safety cushion in case of loss of control and then begin troubleshooting the issue. But even gaining altitude was no easy task. The aircraft was completely uncontrollable in roll, frequently assuming extreme bank angles that resulted in rapid altitude loss. As the pilots struggled to understand the aircraft's completely unpredictable responses to their inputs, Flight 1388 embarked on a roller coaster trajectory that seemed unending. After initially climbing to about 10,000 feet, at 1:38 p.m., the aircraft suddenly rolled and dropped 5,000 feet in mere seconds. The descent rate briefly reached minus 20,000 feet per minute, and the occupants were subjected to a crushing G-force of 5 Gs during the recovery, nearing the aircraft's structural limits. The pilots were fortunate that the E-190 was flexible enough to withstand it, as they came alarmingly close to tearing off the wings. After this terrifying plunge, the aircraft oscillated violently between 5,000 and 7,000 feet for several minutes. However, at 1:45 p.m., the pilots managed to climb back above 10,000 feet, only to enter another nosedive, losing around 4,000 feet and generating 3.5 Gs, once again exceeding the aircraft's design load limit. Yet, the plane held together, and the pilots climbed again, this time reaching 16,000 feet. While conducting tests by engaging and disengaging controls, at 2:03 p.m., the flight suffered another setback. The aircraft flipped completely upside down and began a rapid descent, with a vertical speed exceeding 20,000 feet per minute. Airspeed soared past 350 knots as the ground proximity warning system blared. Recovering from this dive was no easy task due to the high speed. If they pulled up too aggressively, they risked overstressing the aircraft's structure, causing it to break apart in midair. However, if they were too gentle, they wouldn't have time to level the plane before crashing into the ground. It was a delicate balance, but the pilots managed to strike the right approach. After losing over 10,000 feet of altitude in less than a minute, Flight 1388 began to level out. The pilots, shaken by the abrupt fall yet alive, realized they were flying on borrowed time and that sooner or later their luck would run out. Fearing an imminent crash, they thought about the people on the ground and contacted the Lisbon area controller.
Air Astana 1388, requesting vectors to fly over the ocean. We are completely out of control. We could crash at any moment. We cannot risk the lives of people on the ground.
The Lisbon controller eventually gave them a heading toward the ocean. However, to the pilots' great frustration, they couldn't follow the instructions for more than 3 seconds at a time. As the plane continued to lurch side to side and up and down, the pilots kept searching for solutions. It was then that they had a brilliant idea: to consult the 3 Air Astana technicians aboard to see if they knew anything about the work performed on the aircraft during the inspection. It turned out that the technicians had the complete documentation describing all the maintenance performed. Following the pilot's instructions, they began reviewing it until they found undeniable proof. An entry in the log that read, "Aileron cables replaced." For the first time, the pilots considered the possibility that the ailerons had been installed incorrectly. If that were the case, it would explain nearly everything that was happening. To test their theory, the pilots instructed the technicians to observe the movement of the ailerons from the passenger cabin while they performed several rolls. The technicians confirmed what the pilots now suspected. The ailerons were moving in the opposite direction of their commands. At 2:38 p.m., armed with a complete understanding of the problem's nature, the pilots were able to adjust their inputs to avoid significant deviations from controlled flight. By this point, the crew had been flying over central Portugal for more than an hour, with no idea where they were or where they were headed. The controller suggested landing at Beja Air Base, a nearby military airfield with good weather and a long runway. To assist them in locating it, 2 Portuguese Air Force F-16s were dispatched to intercept the aircraft, reaching them shortly after 2:45 p.m. Under the guidance of the F-16s, the pilots managed to maneuver the plane for a straight-in approach to runway 19 right at Beja Air Base. However, as they neared the airport, the aircraft began to swing side to side again, completely veering off the flight path. It was likely that the pilots had unconsciously reverted to normal roll inputs during the high-stress approach. As the aircraft approached the threshold, Captain Oshev called for a go-around, and Flight 1388 pulled away for a second attempt. This marked the breaking point for First Officer Karasholakov. The youngest crew member was severely traumatized and mentally exhausted by the events of the flight. Feeling incapable of continuing his duties, he stepped down. Captain Oshev instructed a switch in co-pilots, and safety pilot Sokolov took the right seat for the second approach. However, the second attempt failed for the same reason as the first. The crew couldn't stabilize the approach enough to ensure a safe landing. As they climbed away once again, Captain Oshev decided on a drastic new approach. No one would touch the ailerons at all, and they would steer using only the rudder. Initially, this technique seemed promising, and the third approach appeared on track for success. But at the last moment, the aircraft began to tilt to the left, pulling away from the runway at less than a minute from landing. Thinking quickly, Oshev announced a change of plans. They would land on parallel runway 19 left instead of 19 right. At 3:27 p.m., Flight 1388 finally touched down on the runway. Although the aircraft nearly veered off to the left, crushing several edge lights in the process, the pilots managed to keep it under control. At last, after nearly 2 hours in the Air Astana Embraer came to a stop, battered but intact, overcoming incredible adversity. What had happened? How could the technicians install the ailerons incorrectly without anyone noticing? When Flight 1388 landed, investigators from Portugal's Office of Investigation and Prevention of Accidents in Civil Aviation and Rail were already en route to Bahia. The agency had been alerted while the aircraft was still airborne, during its uncontrolled phase, when it seemed almost certain to crash. Although they were relieved to find the plane intact after landing, the investigators knew Flight 1388 had narrowly avoided disaster and warranted a thorough investigation. A close inspection of the aircraft revealed just how close they had come to catastrophe. After repeatedly exceeding the design load limit, the wings, skin panels, and fuselage structure had undergone irreversible deformation, with numerous measurements found to be out of tolerance. As for the crew, they had endured their own toll. Several occupants had to be treated for severe nausea caused by the aircraft's erratic maneuvers, including First Officer Karasholikov, who was the worst affected. Additionally, all 3 pilots experienced psychological strain from the prolonged period of near-certain death. They were granted indefinite leave until they felt ready to return to the cockpit, which they eventually did after some time. Meanwhile, in Beja, one of the first things investigators examined was the aileron control cables. As suspected, the up and down cables for both wings had been switched near where they connected to the no-contact structural supports during recent maintenance. The E190's ailerons, which control roll, are operated by a traditional system of cables and pulleys that transmit pilot inputs directly to hydraulic actuators. The first of 2 service bulletins addressed reports of excessive cable friction around a support pulley, recommending that the pulley be replaced with a no-contact support. The second bulletin called for replacing the stainless steel aileron cables with carbon steel ones, which are more resistant to wear. On October 17th, technicians completed the replacement of the cables with carbon steel versions. Following proper procedures, they replaced each cable while maintaining the existing configuration, except that the existing configuration was incorrect, and no one realized it. Ultimately, the investigation blamed the aircraft manufacturer for inadequate maintenance instructions, the oversight authorities for failing to supervise a maintenance team that lacked the skills for heavy maintenance, and the flight crew for not detecting the issue during the pre-flight check.